For hundreds of millions of people throughout the world, English is a second language, and this is true not just of ordinary people, but of a surprising number of writers whom we study and who are considered masters of the English language. Of course, in the case of these writers, the statement must not be taken literally. To put it simply, even native speakers who have a superior knowledge of the language may sometimes have problems of sorts with English, and this shares an interesting light on the subtle relation between language, environment, and communication processes, something which relates to all of us. The first important writer to put the case clearly was James Joyce in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, 1916. There's one very interesting passage in this novel which is about a young man, Stephen Dedalus, at school. By the way, this is possibly the first important work in literature to give us a full portrait of a student's life in a high school. And there, in this particular passage, we see Stephen going to meet one of his teachers, the Dean of Studies, who is English, not Irish. "Good morning, sir. Can I help you?" The teacher happens to be there trying to light a fire, and to light a fire, he needs to pour some oil into a lamp, so the teacher says, "There is an art in lighting a fire. Not too much coal," said the dean. "The feeding is a nice problem. We must choose the pure oil, and you must be careful when you pour it in, not to overflow it, not to pour in more than the funnel can hold." Now, mind you, the words highlighted in bold in the text are mine, in the sense that I have highlighted them, and the reason I highlighted them is because they are the words that go to the problem of the English language for Stephen Dedalus. "What funnel?" asks Stephen. "The funnel through which you pour the oil into the lamp." "That," said Stephen, "is that called a funnel? Is it not a tundish?" We have two words here, funnel and tundish, and the dean asks, "What is a tundish?" "That, the funnel." "Is that called a tundish in Ireland?" asked the dean. "I never heard the word in my life." Notice how much stress Joyce lays on the two specific words, tundish, funnel, and how he has the teacher reflect on the linguistic difference. "I never heard the word in my life." And Stephen says, "Well, that is how we call it in Ireland." "A tundish," said the dean reflectively. "That is a most interesting word. I must look that word up. Upon my word, I must." The rhetorical repetition of word is quite clear, and it's quite interesting and very telling for us to see how this hesitation of the dean about the word starts some serious thinking about language, about his own language, in Stephen Dedalus. First of all, he reflects that the man to whom he is speaking is a countryman of Ben Jonson, the famous English Renaissance poet, and he thinks, the language in which we are speaking is his before it's mine, because the teacher is an Englishman. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master on his lips and on mine. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted his words. Why? Because English was an imposed language in Ireland, and we know how much Joyce cared about the issue of language. In Portrait of the Artist, he poses a problem that will become of universal relevance after World War II, with the process known as decolonization. In the presence of an imposed language, as was historically the case in the former colonies, people, and writers especially, were faced with two alternatives: acceptance or refusal of the European language they had been made to learn and use. Let's proceed with order. Acceptance. We have on this side Salman Rushdie, the great Indian writer, who famously says and writes, "English is an Indian literary language." In his essay, "Commonwealth Literature Does Not Exist," notice that Commonwealth literature is in inverted commas, Rushdie exemplifies the partial acceptance of English. He writes, "English literature has its Indian branch. By this, I mean the literature of the English language. This literature is also Indian literature. This is acceptance, but it is also, in a way, taking over the language which has been imposed. There is no incompatibility here. If history creates complexities, let us not try to simplify them. Which is to say, it's a fact, a historical fact, that the British were in India, that in many ways English was an imposed language, so let us not simplify that. But it is also true that now English is an Indian literary language. It belongs to India as well as to England. Let us now see the words of another famous writer, the Nobel Prize, Derek Walcott. In 1974, he wrote, in The Muse of History, "Their admirable wish to honor the degraded ancestor limits their language to phonetic pain, the groan of suffering, and the curse of revenge." Here Walcott is saying some New World poets, poets who were born in the former colonies, in their admirable wish to honor their ancestors, insist on the damages brought about by colonialization, but in doing so, they limit their poetic power and strength to the phonetic pain, the groan of suffering, and the curse of revenge. And the three substantives he uses are quite significant. The tone of the past becomes an unbearable burden, for they must abuse the master or hero in his own language, and this implies self-deceit. In other words, they are deceiving themselves, because they curse the former colonial master in the same language which he has taught them, and which they can now use so well. Their view of Caliban is one of the enraged pupil. They cannot separate the rage of Caliban from the beauty of his speech, when the speeches of Caliban are equal in their elemental power to those of his tutor. In Shakespeare's The Tempest, Caliban, the native of the island, speaks English as well as Prospero or the other European characters in the play. The important sentence here is the last one, highlighted, "the language of the torturer mastered by the victim," which is a way of appropriating the imposed language. So we see that Salman Rushdie and Derek Walcott are spokesperson for what we might call acceptance or partial acceptance of a foreign language. For other writers, however, such as George Lamming, this is not true. He identifies with Caliban in an opposite way by accusing Prospero of making Caliban a slave and the English language the prison in which Caliban is enclosed. Prospero believes that Caliban can learn so much and no more. Caliban can go so far and no farther. Prospero lives in the absolute certainty that language, which is his gift to Caliban, is the very prison in which Caliban's achievements will be realized and restricted. Why restricted? Because he will never be as good as Prospero in speaking English, in this case, or any other European language imposed by the colonial masters, since his use of language is no more than his way of serving Prospero. Now, this poses another interesting question for us. What is the good of being taught a foreign language? Is that language given to us as a gift, as Prospero claims he has done for Caliban, or just as a way of enslaving us? Historically, receiving an education in English in an imposed language posed several problems to English-speaking writers born in the Caribbean, for instance, but also elsewhere in the empire. Why? For writers, it wasn't just a linguistic problem, which is a good point actually, because in the Caribbean, as in Ireland, people were dispossessed of their mother tongue. This is a short excerpt from History of the Voice by the West Indian writer Kamau Brathwaite. In History of the Voice, he writes, "And in terms of what we write, our perceptual models, we are more conscious, for instance, of the falling of the snow than of the force of the hurricanes which take place every year." The falling of snow. Why? Because the English models are all there for the falling of the snow, because there are countless English poems or prose passages which deal with the falling of the snow, while there is no single poem in the traditional canon of English literature which tells of the hurricane. Why? Because that doesn't happen in England or in Britain. Brathwaite continues, in other words, we haven't got the syllables, the syllabic intelligence to describe the hurricane, which is our own experience, whereas you can describe the imported alien experience of the snowfall. And this clearly poses psychological problems as well as linguistic ones. Quite interesting, isn't it, for anyone trying to speak and write in a foreign language?